now. Okay, so Mike, first tell us a little bit about you, where you come from, and when you knew that writing was what you wanted to pursue, how that journey looked like for you.
Well, I grew up in upstate New York, but we moved to New Hampshire when I was 12 because my dad worked for the Air Force. And so we were about an hour outside of Boston. And I started writing for my high school paper when I was like a junior in high school. And the funny thing is, I now write a column called Shooting from the Lip, which I've done for 100 years in the New York Daily News, which is a column. And then it's a bunch of what I think are amusing one liners, which is kind of what I was doing when I was writing in high school. And it would occur to me from time to time that my career really hadn't advanced the way I'd hoped, since I was doing pretty much the same act I'd done in high school. But I went to Boston College and I ended up writing for 3 school papers and working nights at the Boston Globe. So I knew what I wanted to do. I can remember as a kid seeing Jimmy Breslin when his column was starting to run syndicated in the Boston Herald. He did this commercial where he was leaning over an old portable typewriter, and I said, "Oh my God, that looks like the coolest job in the world." So I'm going along and I'm writing for the Heights. So when I was a sophomore at BC, somebody, and I still don't know to this day who did it. I
Mhm.
think it was a legendary sports information director at BC named Eddie Miller, who has since passed, who was really nice to me when I started
Mhm.
writing for everybody. And somebody sent some of my columns to the sports editor of the Boston
Wow.
Globe, Ernie Roberts. And I get a call one day, and I think it's a joke. I think it's one of my buddies pranking me. And he said, "This is Ernie Roberts. Would you like to write a piece for the Globe?" And I said, "Well, let
Wow.
me check my schedule." No, of course. Yeah, I said, "Yes, Mr. Roberts, I'd love to." So I wrote this piece. Every year at BC, there was a baton twirler called the Golden Girl. It was like a big deal, and she'd perform at halftime of the football games and everything. And it was a woman named Pam Lake. And I wrote this piece about Pam Lake, and I can tell you what the lead sentence was. It was, "She has the best pair of hands on the Boston College campus, but she doesn't play football." That was the lead. They
So
ran this
good.
piece on the front page of the Boston Globe the next day. And from that moment on, my course was set for what I wanted to do. And by the time I had graduated from college, I had written for Boston Magazine and the Boston Phoenix and the Boston Globe, and
And
then I was freelancing for a year. I thought I would go to work for the Globe, and then the sports editor decided to be a hardo, and he said, "Well, you can cover high school football." I said, "I did that when I was in high school."
Mm.
So I freelanced for a year,
Wow.
and and I'm covering the U.S. Open tennis,
Mhm.
freelancing for the Washington Star back
Okay.
in. And I get a call from Ike Gellis, who is the sports editor of the New York Post, this is the pre-Murdoch Post, and it was like the best sports section at the time.
Mm.
And asked me if I'd like to come in for an interview, and could I bring some clips? Well, this is 1,000 years before the internet. My little pathetic clip file is back in my apartment in Brighton, Mass. So the open ends. I fly back to Boston. I get my clips. I fly back on the shuttle to New York, and I go into Mr. Scared to Death. I go into Ike Ellis's office, and he's giving me kind of a hard time. I'm
Mhm.
22 years old, and I finally said, "Mr. Gellis, here's my clips. You're either going to like them or you're not. And if you like them, you probably offer me a job. If you don't, no harm, no foul. I'll go back to Boston."
Right.
So he offers me a job. So I
Wow.
moved to New York in October of that year,
Okay.
and you're on like a 90-day tryout period. I'm scared to death. And I do 4 random features for the sports department uh, the first week.
Oh my god.
And then I go in on Friday to see what my schedule is going to be for the second week.
Mhm.
And the Knicks are opening their season, and the Knicks were far and away the biggest beat on the New York Post. Now,
Mhm.
again, to say that I had been hired out of obscurity is insulting to actually obscure people. I was far more obscure than that. Nobody had any idea who I was. But I look at my schedule and it says Knicks opening night, Knicks sidebar, Knicks, 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 Knicks. So I screw up my courage and I go down to Mr. Gellis, who is like a Damon Runyon character. He's talking to his bookie on the phone. I said, "Excuse me. What?" I said, "Mr. Gellis, I couldn't help but notice that you've got me covering the Knicks next week, and they're starting their season." And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I thought Lenny Lewin, who was a legendary New York sports writer, I thought he covered the Knicks." And I said, not anymore. And he goes, give me the Mets in 5.5. And in that moment,
Whoa.
I found out that I had been hired
After for 1 week.
to cover the New York Knicks without any idea that that's why I was being hired. And it was one more moment in my life where I like fell out of a tree and landed
Yeah.
on my feet. And so I covered the Knicks for a year. And then now I'm 23 and I decide I want a column. So I go into Paul Sand, who is this great, great newspaper man, hired Pete Hamill. He's great. And I said, Mr. Sand, I'd like to write a column. He goes, we have a columnist. We go, get out of my office.
Mhm.
But what I didn't know is the Daily News had an editor named Mike O'Neill at that time.
Mhm.
And his best friend was a guy named Michael Burke, who was president of the Knicks and Madison Square Garden. And he had liked me while I was covering the Knicks.
Mhm.
And there was a very famous New York sports columnist named Dick Young, who had been just like the biggest guy in town for 1,000 years at the Daily News. But he was getting increasingly like MAGA before MAGA. He was getting increasingly My America, all that stuff. And
Yeah.
so Neil's looking for someone to sort of balance this out on his sports section.
Yeah.
And he knows that Mike Burke has been around New York. He ran the Ringling Brothers. He ran the Yankees. He's like one of the most wired, cool guys of all time. And so he takes Burke to lunch and he explains to him what kind of columnist he's looking for. And Burke smiled at him and I found this out later. Michael wrote it to me in a letter.
Oh my gosh.
He said, I can give you 10 names right now from New York and around the country who fit the bill of what you're looking for perfectly. He said, but there's a kid at the New York Post who's going to be better than all of them.
Oh
And
my
on his say
god.
so, I got a column at the Daily News, and that was the real beginning of my newspaper life.
Oh my gosh, what a great story. And would you say you're like the first in your family? Like, were your parents really creative, or were you like kind of you kind of
No,
went off
my
the
dad
path of
was a war hero. He was a 20 and 21-year-old bombardier out of upstate New York. And my mom was one of those moms who came out of the generation where she was there every day when I came home from school.
Yeah.
That was her passion, her dream, her ideal. And no, my dad though gave me the greatest piece of newspaper advice or career advice anybody's ever given me. He said, if you don't promote yourself, nobody else will. He said,
Mm,
don't wait for somebody else to promote you.
mm,
And so no, they just cheered me on. My dad in particular was the best person,
yeah.
best person I've ever known.
Yeah. And you named like quite a few like awe moments for you and your career, but can you tell us a moment as a sports writer when you knew you made it while reporting, or a moment that you reported on that you were like, I made it?
I had been in New York about 10 minutes and Walt Frazier got traded. The legendary Nick got traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers. And he told people that the way I had written about him ran him out of town. And I'm thinking, no, it was the way you played. But no, Maggie, I always felt and still do like
Mhm.
I'm still writing for the school paper. I don't do anything different now than when I was writing for my buddies, when I was writing for the Heights. The size of the audience has never, mattered to me.
Right.
I've always believed that I could do it. I mean, if I lacked confidence, I never would have become a co-writer with Jim Patterson, because you're walking into the biggest room in the world. But
Mhm.
we'll get to this. But the day we met, we just hit it off. It's amazing to us still that it took us as long as it did for us to meet, much
Right.
less. Right. But no, listen, people always ask me, what was the best night you ever had
Yeah.
in sports writing? And it came relatively early in my career at the Daily News, because I was in Lake Placid the night we beat the Russians the Soviets in hockey.
Oh
And
my
America,
god.
I was there for every game they played in Lake Placid. Those are
Wow.
my guys. I still know Ruzioni, Jim Craig, and that night when we won that game.
Mhm.
And I was looking the other day. They were showing, this Herb's speech, Kurt
Mhm.
Russell
Oh,
as
yeah.
who we
The
should have won the
miracle
Academy
speech,
Award.
yeah.
Yeah, this is your time. That night I knew I had probably seen the greatest sports event I was ever going to see in my life. That's 44 years ago, and nothing has
Wow,
topped it since.
wow, true. Next question, what do you think that, because there are gonna be a lot of writers who listen to this and read this, what do you think are just essential characteristics that you've had and carried with you that have made you be a great writer, and what characteristics do you think writers need to have in order to be a good writer?
Well, the biggest thing that Jim and I share in common, other than bad golf, is
Uh-huh.
we write every day. We
Yeah.
don't consider it a chore to write every day. We feel like we have somehow dropped the ball if we don't write. I write every day. He writes every day,
Mhm.
and there is no greater training ground just to my point of view for a novelist than being a newspaper columnist.
Hmm.
You have to tell a story. You have to grab the reader's attention. You have to know how to use dialogue. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can't back into things. I mean, anybody who's read Jim's and my book, no, you're in it right away. We don't slow down. We're a speeding train.
Yeah.
And you gotta hang with us and keep up and keep turning the pages. But writing 1,000-word newspaper column 4 times a week, which I've done for 100 years,
Mhm.
couldn't be a better, because here's the thing about that. You just do the math on that. Okay.
Yeah.
1,000 words a day is 5, 6, 7 a week. It
Mhm.
piles up on itself pretty fast. So when Jim and I are working on a book, it goes. It goes. We do that amount of work every single week, and all of a sudden, it's not like we're rushing. It's not
Right.
like we're trying to speed up the process, but all of a sudden, we have a book
Yeah.
because the story carries us along. I mean, we talk about this all the time.
Yes.
The Alan Bennett, the great English playwright and screenwriter, once said that the best part of being a writer is finding out that you know things that you didn't know you knew. And
Mhm.
I was working on, my part of our new book today, and all of a sudden something happened that I didn't know was going to happen. And I said, "Oh my God, this really is the greatest. It's the greatest job in the world."
That's so great. And before we get to Jim too, I wanted to ask, because I know that you are a wonderful father, now grandfather, and I wanted to ask, how do you think that is becoming a father and grandfather, has that changed your writing style or changed how you work, anything like that? I know
No,
how
being
much
a
you love it.
when I was writing books for young readers, which I did
Yes.
for 15 years, and it started when my middle son got cut from a travel basketball team for being too small,
Mm.
and my friend Jeff Van Gundy, when it happened, said, if this were the movies, you'd take all the kids who got cut, you'd start a team of your own, and you'd win the big game at the end. I said, well,
Right. Right.
2 days later, and I've been telling kids this forever, that the problem with a good idea is once it gets inside your head, it's impossible to get out. So I did take all the kids who got cut.
Oh
I
my
started a team of my own. They were awful. They
God.
were
Not
awful.
like the movies.
No, no. We started out and we couldn't get the ball past half court. And I went to the coach after like 3 games, and I said, we have to call this off. This is like, for all of my good intentions, this is like a science experiment that's gone horribly and tragically wrong. And he said, no, I think they're getting better. I said, no, 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 no. They're not getting better. They're getting worse. I said, there's 2 boys on this team. I'm not certain that they're right-handed any longer.
Oh
And
my god.
but here's what happened. They picked themselves up. They became a real team. They won some games. And I wrote a novel called Travel Team that came out 20 years ago, October of 2004.
Wow.
And within 10 days, it was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. But all because of this experience that had come out of me and one of my children, all of whom I coached in sports. And
Right.
so, no, they just make me smarter. My boys in particular know way more about sports than I do. My boys and my daughter have taught me this about sports, and I always am mindful of it. They think the good old days are now. You know,
Mm,
I can glaze their eyes by. I mean, I can tell they want to know about history, and they love the stories of the Miracle on Ice team and all that stuff. But kids think the good old days are now, and you know what? I'm totally on board with that.
yeah, that's good advice. Good advice. Okay, so now on to your collaboration with James Patterson. You have published 4 novels together now, written 5, and are writing your 6th.
2
Is
are
that
done. No, no, 2 more are done.
oh,
The
shit.
last Jane Smith will be out in the summer of 2025, and then we have one that's a honey, as Elmore Leonard used to say, that we can't say the name yet, but that will be out
Yes.
the next year after that. And Maggie, you know this because you've traveled with Jim and I on the
Yes.
crazy book tours of ours. But I was just thinking, Mike, it's time to give back. It's time to give back and find a writer that you think you to whom you can give a boost. Who can you pay it forward with? Oh wait, I know. Maybe the guy who sells more books than anybody on the planet and the greatest storyteller of his time. No, we can't even remember who. I think he had one of our friends from Little Brown, Ned Rust, reach out to me or whatever it had, and we met in a bar and we started talking about a kid's book that
Right.
we had discussed about the world of show jumping because Jim was fascinated by the fact that older women, younger women, men, women were all competing in the same sport, and he was kind of aware that my daughter had become a champion show jumper,
Yeah.
and we literally after this one meeting, and after him not having second thoughts uh, about working with me after an extremely long night. As you've heard me say on tour, Jimmy
Yes.
Breslin always said that the test of a good idea is whether or not it can last through a hangover, and
Yes.
so he had not changed his mind. And then about 2 days later, he called me. He said, "This is not a kid's book." He said, "This is a multi-generational story about 3 women: a grandmother, a mother, daughter, and a dream about for the mother and daughter about going to the Olympics." It became the Horsewoman.
Oh,
And I'm sure that the Patterson files out there said, wait, 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 whoa, whoa, whoa. He's writing with this sports writer, and Jim Patterson has written a book about equestrians and show jumping,
mhm.
and it debuted at, I think, number 4 on the New York
Yeah,
Times,
and
and
had
we
really
were off,
long legs for
and we've come, and then came House of Wolves, and then came 12 Months to Live, and then it came Hard to Kill, and Never Say Die is coming, and now
yeah.
Renee Zellweger is going to play our Jane Smith for Max, and it's been the greatest thing that has ever happened to my career. And again, I've been blessed to do an awful lot in my career. I mean,
Mhm.
I was on the sports reporters on ESPN for 28 years. I'm honored to be in the Sports Media Hall of Fame. I'm still writing a newspaper column,
Yeah.
and then I had this whole different world open up for me in books for young readers. But this experience, working with this man who has become one of the best friends I've ever had, and getting a master class in storytelling along the way, as we have, and you know this better, that we have big stupid fun
Yes.
every day. We talk way too much on the phone. When we play golf, the caddies refer to it as the show. But what we tell people on the road, and you see these crowds we get when we go on the road,
You
they're really seeing what our working experience is like.
yes.
They see this interaction between us where we finish each other's thoughts, and you've heard me say this before. We'll have what we think is our last of 5 or 6 phone calls of the day when we're working on a book, and I'll say, okay, that's it, I'll talk to you tomorrow. And then a half hour later he'll call or I'll call and say, okay, but that thing we were talking about before, what if we did
Yes.
this instead? And that's the way it's been.
So great. What strengths do you think each of you bring to the collaboration? Like, if you had to pick biggest strengths.
Other than me being funny, or
Yes. Great.
me being the funny
Smart.
one. Yeah,
No.
you laugh. Yeah, by the way,
Oh,
this young woman who's interviewed me, she thinks it's funny when we're on the road to bring walkers for Jim and I, because she's afraid because all
That
she's
too.
thinking is
We'll
if one
fact
of
check
them
that.
gets clipped crossing a street like in Towson, Maryland, my career is over. So she like no, she treats us like invalids. She's afraid to let us no. What strengths? Listen, we both I think we're both very strong on story. I think if I didn't think I wrote the best dialogue, I think he wrote the best dialogue, or vice versa.
Yeah.
He has made me the sworn enemy of backstory. If you try to get backstory in one of our novels, it better be really important, because we just push ahead. I've got all these little notes on my desk, Pattersonisms, stakes, movie moments, all of that stuff, and it's short chapters, move the story along, because everybody knows what a bear he is for outlines. So
Yeah.
the car never gets too far off the road, and I'll mention, so we'll be well into a book one time, and I'll say, hey, I thought maybe this would work, and Jim will say, Mike, it was in the outline. I said, of course it was. Of course it was in the outline. Everybody knows what was in the outline. I was just testing you, Jim.
To see if you knew. Oh, wow, that's great. Okay, so to sum kind of it all up, which I feel like I'll ask a lot, is I feel like a lot of people think there's this secret to James Patterson's success, and we want to ask the co-authors, do you think there is one? And if so, what is it? Have you cracked the code? And yes, that's
Yeah,
the
talent. Yeah, talent, an unbelievable work ethic,
Mhm.
um, an actual ability, quite seriously, to pay it forward. I mean, I needed Jim a lot more than he needed me, and now all of a sudden, we've got a partnership that's become like our own little personal, brand. And I think we've set the bar pretty high for ourselves. But
Yes.
I have to tell you, any brief period where we're not working on a book together, I feel like this is great void in my creative life, because once we're in it, and once we're passing stuff back and forth every day, there's an energy, there's a synergy, and I keep saying this. It's the biggest fun I've ever had in my life as a writer. But I learned something from him every single day about how to construct a good story, how to move a good story, and sometimes how to end a good story. We were working on House of Wolves,
Yeah.
and we had written this final scene at the time.
Mhm.
And I called up and I said, okay, so after this, maybe should we have Jenny go back to San Francisco? And he goes, Mike, the book's done. I said, well, I was thinking I was thinking about the next scene. He
Yeah.
said, Mike, you're not listening to me. There is no next scene. Write the end, and we're going to get on to the next book.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you, Mike. That was all my questions, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but thank you, thank you, thank you. You're the best ever for doing this. And
Thank you, Maggie. And I just rethink the Walker thing, because it
okay.
really, it kind of, it hurts. It hurts
I
our,
will fact check that for all listeners.
no,
No.
when we see you pull them out, when we're just going from the hotel to lunch, it hurts our feelings. Okay. So just, be mindful of that. Okay.
Okay. I will. I will. You're the best. Oh my
Bye,
God.
Mag.
Thank you. Thank you seriously, Mike.